by one, 3 men of various ages and a woman much younger than Gina also shook her hand and introduced themselves. And when they finished, Marianne looked on warmly and asked, "Is this your first time here?" "Is it that obvious?" Gina blushed, unsure why the mellow laughter from the small group comforted her. "Oh, no, honey," Marianne said. "I'm here just about every morning, so I tend to notice new faces. Have you been to any other meetings?" "This is my first meeting ever." Gina's own voice sounded foreign, meeker, as though a shy teenager had spoken for her. "Welcome," the oldest of the men said. "You're in the right place." He had long gray hair pulled into a ponytail, janky teeth, and faded, indecipherable tattoos on the backs of his hands. His clothes were pure biker, the worn leather jacket and chaps over his jeans, the heavyweight boots, the whole bit. A pang in her chest, and out of nowhere, Gina thought of Anthony, her first husband and the boy's biological father. They'd been no more than kids when they started dating, still kids when her plans for college a few years after high school derailed and Corey came along. Anthony had loved his old Valkyrie more than anything, and 2 years into their marriage, while Dylan was still a baby and Corey a toddler, he'd left a note on the kitchen table, an apology for taking off for the big summer rally out in Sturgis. The sentiment had tapered off with a promise to call from South Dakota and an estimate that he'd be back in a week or two. But he never called and never came home. He'd left Gina to care for their 2 young sons on her own, and she'd know nothing of his whereabouts until that death notification from the police 6 years later. Having to tell the boys their father had passed away after that phone call. Irrational as she knew it was, she resented him for dying after living as he'd wanted to live, for disappearing from their lives and then speeding down the California coast on Highway 1 and taking one of those cliff-fronted curves a few feet too wide. The biker and the young woman stubbed out their cigarettes in a 5-gallon bucket filled with sand, and everyone aside from Gina began moving toward the door. She couldn't take the first step yet. Although she felt a degree of gratitude for their kindness, her driver's seat tugged at her like a high-powered magnet. If she went inside with them and committed to this, wouldn't she have to keep coming to church basements like this one and bare her soul or listen to sob stories or whatever these people did for the rest of her life? That's how it worked, wasn't it? Her neck tensed as though it had been clapped in irons. She couldn't do it. She should think of an excuse to turn around and hurry to her car and leave. Maybe say something about her kids or rattle off an abbreviated story about how she forgot something at home that needed to be taken care of before work. But the thought of lying made her even more anxious. These smiling people, especially Marianne, seemed to have some deep insight into Gina's story after knowing her for only 30 seconds. And they would all know her excuse was exactly that. Bullshit. And for some reason, she already cared about what they thought of her. "Well," Marianne said, "looks like it's about that time." She placed her hand on Gina's back as a gentle directive after the rest of the group filed in ahead of them. They stepped through the doorway and down a set of echoing stairs, through another doorway, and into a starkly decorated room with beige cinder-block walls and rows of metal folding chairs. An elderly man with an old fedora sitting cockeyed on his head noodled around on the keys of a very old upright piano in the corner. Roughly 20 other people stood or sat, scattered about the basement, many of them a decade or so older than Gina, but also some closer to her age, as well as a few with baby faces, and 1 or 2 who looked so old it may not have been a stretch to say they'd been alive during Prohibition. A group of 4 stood by a large coffee urn with disposable cups in hand, while most others began choosing their chairs, and a bald man with a red and gray beard sat behind a battered old desk, talking to a few men and women in the front row. Gina scanned the 2 boards hanging on the wall just above the bald man's head, each with sentences spelled out in Old English font, the lines numbered 1 through 12. She noticed the word God came up from time to time, and again had a moment of panic when excuses to flee rushed through her mind like white water. Then Marianne tapped her shoulder and handed her a small piece of paper.